The Alden House stood at the end of a road that nobody widened. It had 27 windows and not one curtain ever moved from the inside. The lawn was clipped but not clean, the hedges trimmed but too tall, a place where birds didn't sing, and the wind slowed down. For over 100 years the estate belonged to the Alden name, passed through hands with firm handwriting and colder eyes. Neighbors said they were refined people, proper, generous with donations to the town's church and to the hospital that bore their grandfather's name. But in all those years, not once did anyone in town see a child walk down that gravel path. No toys left out, no baby cries in the night, no chalk marks on the stone steps. It was the kind of absence that should have made people ask questions, but no one ever did. Because the Aldens owned the mill and the mill paid half the town. The census records told a strange story, a house this large, yet always with exactly 2 to 4 adults on record. A couple, a cousin, a governess, sometimes a retired uncle. Never a child, never a birth, never a death. And when the schoolmaster in 1903 knocked to verify why no child from the Alden family ever appeared on his rolls, he later corrected his report, citing clerical error. He left town not long after. People said he'd gone north to care for a sick brother. But no one had known he had a brother. That was how the Aldens worked. They didn't erase you. They rewrote your story until it sounded kind enough to swallow. They hosted garden parties and never took photos. They donated carriages to the local orphanage but never visited. They lit candles on Christmas Eve but never stood near the church. It was easy to call them private. But there was a weight to their privacy, like something heavy living beneath the floorboards, asking to be ignored. Behind closed doors, the house was nearly silent. Servants came and went, most lasted less than a season. Those who stayed longer were never the same when they left. Faces pale, eyes avoiding light, hands that didn't stop shaking even when folded. Some whispered about the West Wing being sealed for restoration, though no workers were ever seen. One maid, Margaret Cole, left a single note before disappearing. It was found tucked into a hymnal she donated to the church days before. It read, "There are rooms that never see sun, and not all beds are empty." No search followed. The note was dismissed as the rambling of a homesick girl. The Aldens, after all, had offered to cover her train fare back to the coast. When children went missing from town, a girl in 1889, a boy in 1912, 2 sisters in 1925, no one dared suggest a connection. The house at the end of the road had no children. The Aldens were respectable, and people needed to believe that respectability meant safety. The sheriff was seen dining with Dr. Emery Alden the same week the Davis twins vanished. That winter, the town received a new library wing gifted by the Aldens in honor of all the young minds yet to come. The dedication plaque was chiseled in marble and gold. The house did not age. Its paint never peeled. Its chimneys never crumbled. And still no school children ever walked its halls. But late at night, some said they saw a faint glow from the attic window, a flicker soft and strange, like a candle behind skin. The orchard behind the house remained untended yet full. No one picked the fruit. Children told stories of hearing lullabies in a language they couldn't name drifting down from the tallest branches. The elders warned them to stay clear, not because it was dangerous, but because it was impolite to trespass on sorrow dressed as privilege. And so the Alden estate stood, untouched and untouchable, as the years turned like pages no one wanted to read aloud. No child ever came out of that house, but no one remembered seeing one go in. Only the walls knew, and the basement hadn't yet spoken. It was a clerk no one remembered hiring who found the ledger, a man too young to be curious and too quiet to be noticed. He'd been tasked with clearing the back shelves of the county records office. a room so dust-choked and dim it smelled more like a crypt than an archive. The wall behind the shelves had warped, the wood bulging just enough to catch a nail, and when the board split, it opened not to rot or rats, but to a narrow cavity lined with brittle paper and a single box, old, locked, and unmarked. The lock was ornamental, long rusted through, and inside was a ledger wrapped in oilcloth so thick the ink on the tag was still legible. Ledger 34, County Expenses. But this ledger did not belong to the town, the church, or the mill. It belonged to the Aldens. Its cover was lined in calfskin, the pages stitched with crimson thread. The writing inside was precise, slanted, almost too neat. The entries began in 1883 and ended in 1944. Each page marked weekly expenses: flour, barley, pork shoulder, rye bread, quinine, kerosene, bedding, linen wraps, opium extract, salt. But the quantities never changed, always in sets of 4, enough to feed and clothe 4 adults. Year after year, war or peace, rain or famine, always 4. But the estate was large. 8 rooms with bedding noted in the deed, 10 hearths, 27 windows. A house that could hold dozens. And yet the purchases remained fixed, clinical, unfeeling. What was stranger was the notation style. Asterisks beside certain weeks, occasional red ink marking an adjustment for consumption. In one entry from May 1902, the note read, "Reduced to 3 for duration, subject non-compliant, disposal necessary." No further explanation followed. An accountant brought in to review the findings said the numbers made no sense. The heating bills were irregular, some winters double what was expected, in others nearly none at all. Food costs spiked in strange seasons, not during holidays or harvest, but in windows where nothing notable occurred. Worse still were the supplemental items listed once every few months hidden between normal entries. Iron collar, padded, ivory bit, opium tincture for minors, bleeding pans, child-size bindings, each listed plainly as if ordering farm tools. One page listed blanket, muffled, repeated 3 times with a final line in faded pencil. None remember the name. Further in, pressed between pages, were receipts. All paid in cash, delivered by private courier, no company logos. One dated August 1919 listed 29 units of barley bread, 2 gallons of vinegar, and a note, "For the quiet mouths." No crust beneath that, a single line written in different handwriting. "A child cannot scream if her jaw is sewn." Officials didn't speak of it publicly. The clerk who found the ledger was transferred. The accountant resigned. The document was filed, sealed, then misplaced again. But copies had already been made. One retired investigator later confirmed a detail the town had long forgotten. In 1904, during a renovation of the Alden cellar, a mason reported finding 5 stone bed-like platforms embedded into the foundation, all sized too short for grown bodies. No mattresses, just grooves in the rock like channels for runoff. He was paid in full and dismissed the next day. No one documented the feature again. The town never asked why a house of 4 needed 16 pillows a year, or why it ordered child-size wool socks every spring but registered no births. The Aldens explained nothing, and silence became habit. What no one dared to say aloud was simple. If the food was only for 4 and the rooms were filled beyond that, then some mouths were never meant to eat. Some were only meant to breathe quietly, or not at all. Dr. Emery Alden was not born with the title. There was no certificate, no board approval, no school diploma that bore his name. He simply began calling himself doctor one year, and the town followed. Not because they believed him, but because it was easier. He spoke softly, smiled rarely, and rarely left the Alden House. When he did appear in town, he carried a black case and walked with slow, deliberate steps, as if measuring the world by the pressure it left beneath his shoes. The people assumed his healing came through herbs, oils, or whispers handed down through generations. They believed in tradition. They did not ask what tincture could still a child's tremor so fast it stopped the heart. They did not wonder why no patient was ever seen entering the house. Only rumors of wagons arriving at dusk and departing by dawn, windows curtained tight. The cellar beneath the west wing of the Alden estate was lined with cabinets of dark oak and glass-fronted drawers, each labeled in Emery's hand. But there were no names, only symbols, dates, and single letters. A triangle etched beside a number, a spiral beside a year, a crude drawing of a closed eye. Some jars held pale yellow liquid, some thick black resin that never moved even when shaken. A few contained small bones suspended in fluid. Others were dry and powdered, sealed with wax and string. The shelves were methodical, alphabetical, not by word but by symbol. No one knew what they meant except him. In one drawer, 14 vials sat neatly in a velvet-lined tray, each with a hand-drawn flower on the label, and a Roman numeral beneath. One was open, the glass stopper left nearby, stained red at the tip. The journal entries recovered decades later did not describe cures. They described thresholds. One page described reducing movement in a subject's limbs by a tincture made of ground poppy, vinegar, and oral extract from the milk tooth of a second-born. Another outlined sleep induction without memory disturbance, using root bark steeped for 11 days and filtered through wool taken from a crying infant's shawl. Emery wrote not like a man trying to ease pain, but like one chasing silence. His remedies were not for healing, but for erasing. One entry asked simply, "How long must a body be kept warm before it forgets it was ever cold?" He did not call his patients by name. He referred to them as subjects or regressions. The only sign of identity came in a broken line of scribbled initials across one page, the ink smeared, as if the pen had trembled or the writer had wept. In town, no one questioned why a man who offered no public practice had access to shipments of rare chemicals. Potassium bromide, belladonna, laudanum in quantities no common physician would require. The town chemist, when questioned years later, admitted he never saw Emery sign for deliveries. They arrived addressed only to the house with invoices paid in cash. One parcel, dated 1917, contained a wooden case of sealed tins labeled, "For isolation, use only." The chemist remembered the smell, like sweet metal and burnt sugar. He never asked again. The walls of the cellar were marked in ways no one noticed at first. Thin red lines scratched into the stone, forming imperfect circles and joined at odd angles. A former police officer would later identify them as alchemical notations, symbols meant to designate stages of transformation. But transformation into what? One segment of the wall bore the letter D, followed by a series of hash marks, as if counting something left unfinished. Emery Alden died in that house. No doctor declared the time. No autopsy followed. He was buried in the family plot under a stone marked simply, "He listened." Years later, when the basement was opened, 3 of his preserved tinctures still remained on the shelf, untouched, perfectly sealed. One was labeled with the date of a missing child. Another with the symbol of a cradle. The third had no mark at all, just clear liquid thick as syrup, waiting. The room had always been called a pantry, though no one recalled it ever holding food. Its shelves were shallow and empty, the wood warped and flaking. The window, painted shut, looked out to a wall of hedge so thick it swallowed daylight before it reached the glass. But what stood out most was the wallpaper. Pale blue with hand-painted lambs, drums, and rattles, faded in places but untouched by mold or time. That detail bothered the inspectors more than anything else. The rest of the house showed its age, but this room looked preserved, like something had refused to let it rot. When the floorboards creaked under their weight, they assumed water damage. But the resistance wasn't damp wood. It was something beneath, sealed tight with nails too clean to be a century old. The removal took hours. Each plank was layered with thick tar paper, then hammered down again, as if someone had been desperate not just to cover but to smother. Beneath that was a hollow space, shallow but wide, a crawl space not mentioned on the original blueprints. There were no lights, but the walls reflected a strange sheen, like the air inside had never been allowed to breathe. What they found there did not belong to any pantry. The crawl space was lined with iron hooks set in a perfect grid across all 4 walls. Some held bits of torn fabric. One had a leather strap still buckled. Along the ceiling, a metal grate spanned the length of the space, rusted but intact, woven tight like a sieve. Experts said it was a form of soundproofing, the kind used in cold storage to dampen echoes. In the far corner, just below a vent that led nowhere, sat a small wooden chair with no legs. It had been bolted directly into the stone. A faded cushion was nailed to its seat. And beside it, on the floor, was a cracked porcelain teacup with dried brown residue that later tested positive for blood. On one wall, childlike drawings had been scratched into the stone with what looked like a spoon. Crude stick figures, some missing arms, others with crosses for eyes. One figure was drawn over and over, a tall person with no face and a wide skirt. Above the figure, in a shaky hand, were the words, "She watches the hush." The marks were layered deep, suggesting years of repetition, as if someone had drawn the same nightmare again and again, trying to warn or remember or forget. What made the space most disturbing wasn't just the cruelty of what it contained, it was the size. The crawl space was too low for any adult to stand and too narrow for a bed. It was built with exactness, proportions matching a child's reach, a child's step, a child's scream muffled by design. No names were carved, no initials marked the wood, just tools, restraints, and walls that held the smell of salt and metal long after the door had been pried open. Later it would be discovered that a pipe once ran from the crawl space into a furnace chute, a detail the Aldens claimed was an old ventilation line. But the pipe was one way, from the room outward, never inward, an air shaft meant to drain something, breath, sound, or heat. In 1931, a local plumber noted the house had an unusually complex heating system with sealed flues and hidden switches. He never completed the job. His body was found weeks later, drowned in the mill pond. The nursery, if it ever was one, had no crib, no rocking chair, no signs of love. Just wallpaper too cheerful for its purpose and a floor that once held silence like a secret. A forensic pathologist would later say the layout resembled an old asylum holding pen, repurposed and downsized. Only one conclusion could be drawn. This was not a room for rest. It was a chamber built to unmake something, to fracture it slowly, cleanly, until it forgot it was ever whole. She was never enrolled in school, no birth certificate, no known last name. Just a girl of about 8 or 9 who lived at the edge of the orchard line in a house that barely stood. Her mother took in laundry. Her father drank and vanished before winter. The town never asked much of children like her, poor, quiet, eyes always scanning the ground as if afraid to meet the horizon. She was seen often, though never noticed. Sitting alone by the creek, tracing chalk lines on the barn wall, counting stones with the kind of rhythm that makes adults look away. The neighbors didn't know her name, but they called her 11 because she always counted to that number before going silent. Never 12, never back to 1. In the spring of 1926, she vanished. There were no flyers, no town search, just one less set of bare feet in the mud, one less cracked plate at the doorstep. Her mother said she'd gone to live with an aunt, but no one asked which one. The girl had once spoken to the preacher's wife in a voice barely more than a whisper. She'd said the house at the end of the road had a white room inside it where no windows opened and no clocks ticked. She said the walls had eyes but didn't blink. The preacher's wife told her not to repeat lies and sent her home. That was 3 weeks before she disappeared. What remained of her was not a body. It was a drawing found in the summer of 1952 when the Alden well was dredged for repairs. Tucked between stones near the base, dry in a pocket of settled ash, was a page from a child's sketchbook. It showed a square room with no doors and a single iron crib in the center. Inside the crib sat a figure. Not a baby, but something shaped like a girl, thin arms crossed over where her mouth should be. The face was hollow, 2 black circles for eyes and no teeth, no tongue, no lips. Just a smooth line where the mouth belonged, as if sewn shut or erased. Beneath the sketch was a single word written in backwards letters. Hush. The handwriting matched a set of old homework sheets recovered from the abandoned shack where the girl once lived. The loops, the slant, the way she formed the letter S. It was her hand. A forensic analyst decades later confirmed it without question. The drawing had been hers, but no one could explain how it reached the Alden well, buried under decades of discarded soot and bone dust. Further investigation revealed something more. In one of Emery Alden's journals, an entry dated May 1926 read, "Subject 11 displays anticipatory behaviors, speaks in riddles, sings at intervals during administration, may require oral removal to prevent self-report. No name was given, just a number. 11. The date matched the week the girl disappeared." Another page, torn but partially legible, listed an observation. Drawing helps her retain silence, encouraged twice daily. It was not the absence of a report that haunted those who uncovered the truth. It was the way she had tried to leave a record, not through screaming or letters or blood, but through pictures, crude soft pencil lines on crumpled pages no one thought to keep. A child with no paper trail except the one she drew herself, hoping someone would see it before the well filled again. And still, no one asked what happened to the girl with no name. Because if no one wrote it down, it didn't need to be remembered. Beneath the Alden stables, where the earth was packed hard with the weight of a century's hoofprints and hay rot, there was a door made of stone and rusted iron. It had no handle, only a groove worn from years of pressure applied in silence. The workers assumed it led to an old ice cellar or storage for animal feed. But behind it, the air changed. It grew sterile and sharp, like medicine that had turned sour. The steps descended not into earth, but into tile. White squares too clean for their age, arranged in patterns not found in country homes, but in sanitariums and military hospitals. The walls held fixtures for copper sconces, but no candles remained. What remained was the smell, something between vinegar and blood, clinging to the corners of the ceiling as if even dust avoided it. At the center of the room, a single iron drain sat beneath a series of crossbars fixed into the ceiling. Chains hung from some, others had hooks with ridges filed smooth. The copper around them had corroded into green streaks as if something acidic had passed over them too many times to be accidental. There were no tools left behind, no linens, no bowls, just outlines of where objects had once been. Empty rings on the counter, scratched lines where a tray had scraped the tile again and again, a square imprint on the wall where a cabinet once hung. A medical engineer brought in from the city later identified the room's layout as resembling a historical decontamination chamber used in the late 19th century for sterilizing infected patients and contaminated gear. But there were no signs this room ever treated illness, no storage for clean supplies, no notes of entry or protocol. What he could not explain was the lack of temperature control. These types of rooms required regulated heat, airflow, sanitation flow. This room had none of that, just copper. And silence. Records pulled from a defunct hospital in Arkwood listed Emery Alden as a donor of unspecified treatment equipment in 1914. A shipment of surgical drainage tubing, formalin, and rubber restraints was signed by a courier bearing the Alden seal but was never used by the hospital. It was returned without a receipt. No one knew where it went. But fragments of that tubing, burnt, stiff, discolored, were later found melted into the tile grout of the chamber beneath the stable. In one corner of the room, beneath a loose tile panel, investigators found the remains of a small glass vial. The label had peeled, but part of the inscription remained legible. Dermaton isolate, a term no longer used, once referring to chemical compounds for separating dead skin. Nearby, in a thin groove along the base of the wall, black residue pooled, later identified as a combination of kerosene and bile. The forensic pathologist called it unnatural. The historian called it intentional. There was a metal plate embedded into the far wall, roughly 4 feet off the ground. It had scratches deep enough to draw blood. Some were straight lines, others curved like fingers caught mid-swipe. Above the plate, an inscription had been etched in Latin and later painted over. Ad purum per dolorem, to purity through pain. The town claimed it was a butcher's cellar, a place for livestock to be cleaned and dressed. But no bones were found, no straw, no evidence of cattle, only human hairs baked into the drainage grates, fine, soft, some no longer than a child's finger. The walls absorbed screams well, the engineer noted. The tile had been sealed with a glaze made of lime and crushed bone designed to muffle echoes. The cleansing room was not for recovery. It was for removal. Of memory, of defiance, of voice. A place where Emery's tinctures met the final test. Where sound was scrubbed from bodies like dirt from skin. And when it was over, the drain accepted what was left, without hesitation, without mourning. For decades, the study was considered the safest room in the Alden House. Its windows were unshuttered. The air smelled of pipe tobacco and dust. Shelves lined the walls with books no one ever touched. History texts, medical compendiums, encyclopedias arranged in perfect alphabetical rows. A large desk dominated the center, clean but for a blotter, a silver inkstand, and a single leather chair pulled out as if the occupant had stepped away for only a moment. It felt orderly, untouched, boring even. Until someone tried to move the bookshelf near the back wall and discovered it didn't move at all. It was bolted into the plaster. Behind it, not drywall but iron. A panel with a brass keyhole no larger than a fingertip. The key was later found hidden inside the spine of an anatomy textbook. Tucked between diagrams of the human pelvis and the development of infant cartilage, it turned smoothly in the lock. The door clicked open with no resistance. Inside was not a vault, not a wine cellar, not a hidden room meant for valuables. It was narrow and dry, about 12 feet deep, and smelled faintly of cloves and old metal. Along every wall were rows of drawers, like a morgue but smaller, too short for bodies, too wide for files. Each drawer bore a tag written in Latin. Words like mandibula seccata, costae obducti, vertebrae numeratae. Below each was a second tag printed in Braille, as if someone had expected the blind to read what the sighted should never see. The drawers opened quietly, well-oiled despite their age. The contents were not preserved in cloth or wrapped in plastic. They sat on black velvet or cotton batting, arranged like museum pieces. One held a child's femur, sawed cleanly down the center and hollowed like a flute. Another contained 2 mandibles drilled with small, perfect holes at each joint. Symmetrical, like the start of an instrument or a failed experiment. A tray of vertebrae had been buffed to a shine, each bone etched with a Roman numeral, the sequence broken only once where a piece had clearly been removed. The missing gap was marked with a torn tag labeled "Failed to withstand pressure." There were no skulls, not one. But some bones bore carvings, not accidental scratches, but words, etchings done with fine blades, letters shallow and deliberate. On one scapula, the phrase "Judicium inversum" was engraved, meaning judgment reversed. Another fragment, a piece of rib, no longer than a ruler, was marked "in essentia." A forensic linguist later confirmed the script matched Emery Alden's handwriting from his earlier medical journals. But the cuts weren't done with pen. They had been engraved with surgical tools, the depth too consistent to be casual. At the center of the room was a small table, no larger than a nightstand. On it sat a book, handwritten and unbound, titled only "Classification." It contained codes, columns of numbers, symbols, and abbreviated notes that no one could fully translate. But some lines stood out. One entry read, "Subject 4B, mandible removed for behavioral correction. Braille tag affixed post-removal to ensure tactile punishment continues." Another line under a section labeled "Repetition Failures" simply said, "Vertebral series incomplete due to premature silence." The words made no sense to doctors, but to psychologists who later reviewed them, they suggested something far worse. That the bones were not trophies, they were records, results. A controlled study conducted over years with ritualistic consistency. No one could explain how the room stayed hidden for so long. Some believed the iron door had been reinforced with lead to block detection. Others suggested it was simply overlooked, swallowed by the house's overwhelming quiet. But the room had not been abandoned. There was no dust on the drawers. The bones were clean. The Braille tags were free of decay, as if someone had touched them often. Someone who understood the language of the blind and the silence of those who could no longer scream. The trunk was found beneath the floorboards of the Alden attic, buried in a hollow between two rafters, sealed behind a panel of old books stacked spine out to mimic a bookshelf. It was wrapped in canvas and tied with a cord so tight it left grooves in the lid. When opened, the smell that escaped was not of age or mildew, but something sharp, like dried ink mixed with dried blood. Inside were letters, dozens of them, each written on the same cream-colored paper, folded with precision, tucked into identical brown envelopes. They were all addressed in the same delicate cursive, the kind taught in finishing school. Gentle loops, perfectly measured strokes. Everyone was signed faithfully and warmly by Aunt Nella. There were no nieces or nephews registered to the Alden family, no birth records, no guardianship papers, no children born or taken in. Yet the letters described lives in detail. Little Clara who wet the bed again, sweet Edwin who didn't speak unless sung to, Margaret who flinched when touched but who finally let Aunt Nella braid her hair. The tone was loving, careful, even doting. But beneath the affection was something cold, something rehearsed. There was mention of healing treatments, of stillness as progress, of silence as a virtue. One letter read, "Dear Thomas, today you earned your supper by being brave during the immersion. You didn't scream once. You're almost ready now." Another praised a girl for accepting her bindings without tears, noting that the stiller she lay, the better her fever seemed to behave. Each letter had a different name, but all came from the same voice. A voice that knew how to sound kind while twisting cruelty into care. Some were dated back to 1897, others as recent as 1942. The postmarks came from towns scattered across 4 states. Most were small, forgotten places. When compared against newspaper archives, an unsettling pattern emerged. Each town had reported a child missing within a year of the letter's date. Never more than one. Never widely investigated. A boy gone while walking to church. A girl vanished from a picnic. A toddler last seen near a traveling medicine show. Local tragedies unconnected by law but linked in the back of this trunk by a hand that never aged. The stationery remained pristine, but one letter bore a dark thumbprint over the salutation. Not ink, but something later identified as congealed bovine serum, often used in early experimental transfusions. A detail no schoolchild would have access to. But Emery Alden would, and so would his sister Nella. Though never listed on official records, her name appeared once in a probate dispute over the estate's west wing. Described as a long-term resident with personal ties to the family, she never testified. She never appeared in person. She signed with a Tayudo black glove. Some letters were marked with odd numbers in the margins. One bore a symbol, a small triangle with a dot in the center matching a mark found etched beneath the grate in the nursery crawl space. Another ended with a line that read, "Tomorrow we try the reflection test. If she cannot find herself, perhaps she can finally be free." The handwriting remained soft, nurturing. But the content made it clear to Saul these were not keepsakes. They were confessions without guilt, stories written to no one, meant to be stored and reopened like trophies of discipline masquerading as love. The last letter in the trunk bore no name, only a line across the top. "This one listens too well." The envelope was empty. Its flap was sealed with wax that had cracked into a shape resembling a child's open mouth. Whether Aunt Nella ever existed didn't matter. Her voice did, and her voice was not loving. It was deliberate. It was patient. And it never forgot what silence was for. In the far corner of the second-floor sewing room, behind bolts of unused fabric and a collapsed loom, there stood a cabinet few ever noticed. It was lacquered in black, its hinges silent, its keyhole sealed with wax instead of a lock. When pried open, the scent that escaped was not of cedar or dust, but something older. The coppery ghost of dried blood tangled with parchment. Inside were 12 shallow drawers, each lined with glass and each holding something that didn't belong in any house that called itself a home. They were sheets, not paper, not cloth, but skin. Thin, fragile, translucent sheets of stretched and treated human skin layered flat like writing pages in a child's desk. The edges were trimmed neat, some stitched with tiny threads along the corners as if meant to be preserved, not hidden. Under certain light, the pores still showed. On others, the curve of a knuckle or the faint whirl of a fingerprint had not been fully erased. Each piece bore writing, but not the hand of a doctor or scholar. The marks were inconsistent, jagged, uneven, the writing of many different children, letters written backward or too tall, or trembling with pressure. Some messages were only names, others held fragments of thoughts. One read, "I remember the window was fake." Another said, "My shoes are gone, but I hear them walking." There were no dates, no locations, just broken sentences scrawled in brown ink that later tested positive for gall mixed with human serum. The ink had been harvested, not purchased, and it had come from the same bodies that left their skin behind. One sheet stood out among the rest. It was larger, more intact, and it bore a title, "My Sunless Birthday." The words were cramped into the upper corner, as if the writer had been limited to the space and told not to waste it. The story was written in short lines like poetry or prayer. It described a small cake that wasn't eaten, a song that wasn't sung, and candles that didn't burn because there was no light allowed that day. The final line read, "She said the real gift was staying quiet." The skin was so thin the writing had begun to seep through to the other side, staining the velvet it rested on. In Emery Alden's journals, there are mentions of a process called dry binding, a method he described as preserving memory through tactile imprint. One entry outlined the skin's preparation in stages: bleaching, pressing, curing with salt and formalin, followed by consent imprint. The phrase was never explained. Another entry read, "Children write better when they fear forgetting. The body remembers longer when turned into page." His language was clinical, detached, not a trace of guilt, only results. A retired chemist brought in during the estate's later investigation recognized the composition. She noted that in the late 1800s, similar techniques were used in binding rare books with animal vellum, though never human. The texture matched, but the preservation method was unique. It suggested long-term intent. These weren't scraps, they were documents, a macabre archive of obedience and collapse. No one could trace the children by handwriting. Most bore no full names, only nicknames, initials, or lines like "the girl in chair 3" or "mine was the green blanket." One sheet had a drawing instead, a stick figure beneath an arched doorway with the word "listen" written 6 times in a spiral. Forensic analysts found impressions beneath the ink, as if the writer had rewritten the same message again and again until the skin itself had thinned in protest. The paper skin method, as it came to be called in the hidden notes of lawmen too afraid to publish them, was not a form of torture. It was a form of authorship, a way to record not just what had happened, but who it happened to. By forcing the victim to become the medium, the message, and the proof, the Aldens had no children, no students, no wards. But they had these pages, and through them the voices they silenced wrote back in whispers that never faded, even after the ink dried. The journal was bound in pale leather, its pages thinner than newsprint, its title pressed in gold leaf so faint it could only be read under angled light. It bore no author, no date, no dedication. Just the phrase "regulation through exposure and withdrawal" stamped across the first page. The handwriting inside matched Emery Alden's, careful, slanted, cold. But this was no medical text. It was not about illness or healing. It was about reordering the body until the mind submitted. The opening line read, "Light is not a right. It is a privilege earned through moral clarity." What followed were page after page of methodical notes describing what he called light isolation trials, experiments designed to correct what he believed were corrupted circadian tendencies, deviations he tied to disobedience, grief, or stubbornness in children he labeled consciously unclean. He spoke of light as punishment, not gift. He described how constant exposure could unravel a subject's ability to sleep, then how complete darkness could reshape their loyalty. In one case, Subject 2 was locked in a lit room for 6 days, with no covering for the eyes and woken every 2 hours by a whistle. After she began to hallucinate, she was transferred to the Blue Vault, a crawlspace beneath the stairwell lined in indigo wallpaper and sealed with bricks behind the air vents. He noted with precision when her crying stopped and when her speech turned to mumbling. But it was Subject 6 that haunted the most. Her real name was never recorded. She appeared in only one photograph, a blurred silhouette behind frosted glass. Time-stamped and labeled with the number 6, her entry begins in March and ends in May. 47 days. That's how long she was kept in total darkness. The space used for her was narrow, less than 5 feet long, with stone on all sides and a slot in the door just wide enough for a tray. There was no lamp, no candle, no reflection, just cold and silence, and air filtered through copper mesh. Each day, Emery wrote her reactions like clockwork. Day 1, subject struggles with sensory loss. Day 3, urine pattern altered, voice trembles. Day 8, denies language, attempts to hum. Day 15, exhibits mimicry of past voices, not her own. Encouraging regression. He noted not only her physical responses but her emotional unmaking, treating her identity like something to be peeled back in layers. He recorded with pride the moment she stopped turning toward sound, and later the day she began repeating a number, not her own, over and over until her voice broke. She repeats 14 as if recalling an earlier identity, he wrote. Assign new number as needed. In the back of the journal, a chart recorded ambient light exposure in minute increments. The cell where Subject 6 was kept had been engineered to reflect no external light. Walls painted with a mixture of lead and powdered glass. The ceiling layered in coal ash. Her food delivered through a black velvet curtain so she could not even see her own hands. There were no clocks. Time was tracked only by the changing temperature of the food tray and the gradual swelling in her knees from sleeping curled. She was not given fabric, no blanket, no shoes. Just her skin and the echo of her breath. On day 31, Emery wrote, Subject begins to fear internal sounds. Breath, heartbeat, stomach, claims they are too loud, covers ears with hands, succeeds only in muting herself. What disturbed later investigators was not the method but the outcome. Subject 6 emerged not screaming, not silent, but smiling. Her pupils did not respond to light. Her voice had reduced to single syllables, repeated not as words but as rhythms, like counting or spells. When she was handed a mirror, she stared for 7 minutes, without blinking. Then she touched her reflection and asked, Is she mine? No answer was recorded. Emery simply wrote, Identity separation achieved. Subject considers reflected self as other. Disassociation complete. She was returned to the chamber 3 days later. No further entries followed. Years later, after the estate was opened and catalogued, fragments of a dress were found in the wall behind that same chamber. The fabric had no color left, only buttons sewn in uneven lines as if stitched by a shaking hand. Inside the pocket was a piece of black chalk wrapped in cotton, a child's tool. Something meant to mark time when no clock existed. On the wall, barely visible, were rows of tally marks etched with slow, uneven care. 47 of them, but the last 5 were longer. Bent, crooked, as if carved without sight, as if she'd tried to count days that no longer arrived. The daylight experiments were never formally documented by any institution. The techniques were not taught. But the logic behind them, that control of light could fracture the will, became a whispered theory in underground psychology circles. Emery believed that darkness didn't just silence a child. It hollowed her out, replaced memory with obedience, and in that void he thought was purity, not healing, not comfort. Just a hollow girl staring back through a mirror asking who owned her shadow. In the Alden family plot set on a low hill behind the orchard where no trees ever grew straight, there stood a gravestone no one could explain. It was smaller than the others, sunken deeper into the earth, its edges rounded not by time but by erosion that seemed almost deliberate, as if wind and rain had been told to forget it. The name carved into the stone was Eliza. No middle initial, no surname, no dates. Just 5 letters crookedly etched by hand rather than chisel. It sat between 2 Alden family stones, though no records placed her there. The town clerk confirmed she did not exist in any birth registry. The church kept no baptism for her. No census ever recorded an Eliza living on the estate. Yet someone buried her, and someone gave her a name. The children in town used to talk about her, but only in fragments like stories passed in whispers before being taken back again. They said she wore white even in the rain, that she stood still near the orchard fence, not moving, just humming softly as the sun went down. One child claimed Eliza never blinked. Another said if you stared at her long enough, your ears would start to ring. Then go quiet and you'd forget why you'd come outside. Most adults dismissed the stories as nonsense, children's games. But the orchard itself held something uneasy. Pear trees that never bore fruit, grass that grew too thin, soil that smelled faintly of bleach after storms. One tree leaned sideways like something had hung from it too long. No one cut it down. When the Alden records were later re-examined, there was a single entry that might have pointed to her. A maintenance log from 1911 listed a purchase of linen dress, youth size, and burial cloth, white, child length. But the document was never signed, and the supplier had gone out of business before the invoice date. Other clues came slowly. A photo, recovered from beneath a drawer lining in the study, showed a girl standing beside the back gate. Her face had been scratched out, but her outline remained. Slim, still, too pale against the ivy-covered fence. On the back, someone had written, "Return to quiet," in pencil so faint it was nearly dust. Years later, after the orchard was cleared and the soil tested, investigators found traces of calcium in strange, irregular concentrations. Small pockets, too high to be natural, too shallow to be adult. A forensic specialist believed they were bone fragments crushed and left unburied. The town by then had long stopped asking questions. Eliza had become a name no one dared repeat out loud, not because they feared her, but because remembering her meant accepting she had been real. And if Eliza was real, then so were the others. The nameless, the numbered, the ones who never left the orchard gate open. In the deepest corner of the Alden basement, past the locked cabinets and rusted gurneys, beyond the door marked with a single letter F scorched into the wood, sat a furnace no one remembered being installed. It wasn't part of the original blueprints, and no service logs or permits listed its construction. It was built directly into the stone foundation, almost as if the house had been constructed around it. A mouth of iron and brick, wide enough for a person to step into, lined with soot too thick to be natural. Unlike the hearths upstairs, which were choked with dust and age, this furnace looked active. The metal was warm to the touch when they found it. The air around it held a scent not of old wood or oil, but something sharper. Char, copper, burnt enamel. Investigators believed it had been used recently. Not just during the final years of the Aldens' residence, but after. A trail of melted ash led from the grates to the back wall, where tiny vents had been cut into the stone, allowing airflow without detection. Inside the flue, a recent layer of soot clung to the lining like it had only cooled days before. When they pried open the lower chamber, a trapdoor where larger remains might settle, what they found ended any theory that this was meant for trash or debris. There, fused to a warped slab of iron, was a small scrap of bone. Not animal, human, no more than 3 inches long. Embedded in it was a brass dental wire, melted slightly at the edges but still intact. A child's molar, scorched beyond identification, yet unmistakably once part of a living jaw. The furnace itself had been modified. A pressure gauge had been added to the side, repurposed from what appeared to be medical equipment. Tubes ran from it into a tank of unknown origin, marked only with a faint Alden crest and a warning. Pressure must be maintained. Inside the tank, forensic teams found dried residue, a slurry of fat, calcium, and teeth dust suspended in an oily black paste. This wasn't just for burning, it was for processing. Someone had cared deeply about what remained, not to preserve it, but to dissolve it, to reduce it until it became untraceable. Along the interior walls of the furnace room there were pockets carved into the stone. Shallow recesses no larger than dinner plates spaced in a grid. At first they appeared to be decorative, but when dusted they revealed a strange pattern. Each filled with layers of ash compacted into discs, hardened like coin molds. One disc bore the faint impression of a human ear. Another, when split, revealed a curled lock of hair fused between the layers. They weren't artifacts. They were offerings, or worse, records. Proof that something once living had been measured, burned, and filed away not in books but in fire. An undated page torn from Emery's journal was later recovered from behind a cabinet in the study. It read, "The body resists forgetting. Even in flame it clings to itself. The mouth yields. The hands curl last. But the teeth remember. Always." This note sat beside a drawing of a furnace almost identical to the one in the basement. The only difference was a single word scrawled beneath the sketch: inheritant. Whether it referred to the machine or the person tending it, no one could say. Some investigators believed the furnace had been operated well after the Aldens were gone. The theory suggested someone else had inherited not just the estate, but its rituals. That someone had been trained, quietly, patiently, to maintain the legacy of silence and removal. Several boxes of firewood stacked nearby were untouched. The ash pulled from the hearths upstairs tested positive for pine and oak, but the furnace ash was different. It held bone fragments, copper, lead, and trace amounts of arsenic. No fingerprints were found, no names. Just a lingering warmth, days after the house had gone cold. It suggested someone had stayed, someone who knew how to keep the fire controlled, not wild, not wasteful, just enough to erase, just enough to leave behind a heat that outlasted memory. The outcry began not with the discovery of bones or drawings or journals, but with a photograph. A single image leaked to the press. The sketch of the girl without a mouth, found folded near the Alden well. It ran without a caption, no credit, just a blurred picture on the back page of a state paper, next to a story about drought and rising taxes. But something about it stuck, a face with no features drawn in a child's hand. Parents saw their own daughters in it. Grandmothers saw something they'd once been told to forget. Soon the story spread beyond the borders of the county. Writers came, podcasters came, television. Crews knocked on doors that hadn't opened in years. The town could no longer pretend it didn't know, but it still refused to say it aloud. No one was ever arrested. The remaining Alden descendants denied involvement. The ones still living had changed their names decades earlier and filed formal statements distancing themselves from the estate and from Emery's practices. Most claimed they had never even seen the house. One niece, now in her 70s, testified anonymously that she was forbidden from speaking the family name aloud during childhood. That silence, she said, was how the legacy stayed clean. In the face of growing public pressure, the governor passed legislation known as the Alden Regulation, a law requiring full registration and inspection of all private medical, educational, and experimental facilities. The bill moved fast, unusually fast, as if lawmakers were trying to put a seal over something leaking. But the law made no mention of the specific events. It never used the word child. It never used the word murder. The estate was eventually turned over to the state. The orchard was leveled, the house stripped to its beams. A memorial garden was built near the old foundation, where the walls of the nursery had once stood. 12 granite stones were placed in a circle, each with a number carved into it. 1 through 11, and the last marked simply. A plaque nearby listed no names, just a quote: "For those not spoken of, for those not found." School children were brought there on field trips. Teachers spoke of the dangers of unregulated institutions, of the need for oversight and civic duty. No one spoke of the furnace, or the paper skin, or the things buried too shallow to stay buried. Local officials insisted all records had been released, but the state archive confirmed entire decades of birth and death certificates had been redacted. One journalist uncovered that over 60 birth records were missing between 1889 and 1943, all children born within a 20-mile radius of the Alden estate. Some names could be traced to brief newspaper mentions. A girl lost near the train depot. A boy presumed drowned in the river. But no death certificates were ever filed. They had vanished from public record as completely as if they had never drawn breath. The town itself began to change. The name Alden was scrubbed from public signs. The Alden Street Post Office became Riverfield Branch. The old Alden Library, once the pride of the county, was closed indefinitely for renovation. One by one, landmarks were renamed, painted over, or forgotten. Maps were redrawn, plaques removed. Even the new town museum, built with state funds, made no mention of the house or its history. When asked, curators said the case was still under legal review. That's what they called it now. A case. Not a crime, not a tragedy. A case. Like something that had been solved. But the silence lingered. Local children still whispered of a girl in white who hummed near the new bus stop. Elderly residents crossed the street to avoid the memorial garden. One retired schoolteacher said that in the winter, when the wind came from the orchard side, she could still smell bleach and old metal. A deputy found the word Innocentia carved into the underside of a bench near the courthouse. The carving was new. The tools used matched none of the maintenance staff's, and the cameras didn't catch anyone. The judge ordered it sanded off before morning. What disturbed those who came later, researchers, historians, survivors, was not just what had happened, but how quickly it was swallowed. The law moved, yes. Memorials were built, but nothing ever touched the core. The remains were burned, the walls were torn down. But the record stayed incomplete, the victims unnamed, the system never punished. In the end, it was not justice that followed the Alden legacy, but a kind of ritual forgetting. A collective agreement to say, yes, it was awful, and then look away, because the truth was harder to face. That the evil had not come dressed in rage or chaos. It had come softly, with gloves, with rules, with handwritten notes that said she's learning instead of she's dying. The Aldens were not monsters. They were respected, trusted. Their crimes wore linen and carried books. And that is why no one stopped them. What do you think? Could this happen again? Would we even notice if it already had?